The smell of fresh paint filled the hallway of the Veterans Rehabilitation Center. A young woman, quiet and steady-handed, brushed long strokes of navy blue across a door. She wore no name tag, spoke to no one, and kept her sleeves rolled down even in the heat. Then, one afternoon, a Navy SEAL named Ethan Cole, a man haunted by the ghosts of his past missions, walked by. As she reached for another can of paint, her sleeve slipped back for a moment. On her wrist glimmered a faded tattoo, a black hawk with coordinates underneath. Ethan froze. He had seen that tattoo before, on the wrist of the combat medic who had saved his life in a war zone 3 years ago, a medic who was reported killed in action, and now she was standing right in front of him, painting doors. The Veterans Rehabilitation Center stood on the outskirts of the city, a place where time seemed to move slower than anywhere else. The building was old but dignified, its walls whispering stories of pain, courage, and unfinished healing. Long hallways echoed with the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of a wheelchair. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of pine from the nearby forest, mingling with the sterile tang of disinfectant and paint that hung perpetually in the air. In one of those quiet hallways, Lena Matthews worked with deliberate calm. She wore faded overalls, speckled with years of paint, and a gray cap that shadowed her face. Her hands, though slender, carried a certain roughness that betrayed both strength and experience. She moved with purpose, not rushed, not lazy, just steady, as though every stroke of her brush was a meditation. Lena had been working at the facility for almost 8 months, repainting old doors, trimming corridors, and restoring rooms that had been long neglected. She was not officially part of the staff. She came through a small maintenance agency that took up low-profile government contracts. No one asked too many questions, and Lena never volunteered answers. It suited her perfectly. She rarely spoke. When she did, her voice was soft, the kind that made people lean in to hear, yet always left them with the sense that she had said far less than she knew. Her eyes were a shade of gray that reflected light like steel, and they rarely met anyone else's for long. There was an air of unreachable silence about her, not arrogance, but something like grief that had long since settled into her bones. The nurses often whispered about her during lunch breaks. "She's polite but strange," one would murmur. "Never smiles much. Probably went through something bad," another would guess. "Maybe she lost someone in the service," a third would say, and the others would nod, as though that explained everything. They weren't entirely wrong. There was something military in the way Lena carried herself. The straight back, the precision of her movements, the instinctive awareness of her surroundings. Yet her clothes and her quiet manner erased any trace of her past life. She was just the painter, the woman with the steady hands and distant eyes. She began each morning before sunrise, arriving at the center while the halls were still dim and empty. She'd lay out her brushes, open a fresh can of paint, and let the rhythmic motion of the brush against the door fill the silence. For her, painting wasn't just a job, it was a ritual of control, a way to drown the noise inside her mind. Each layer of paint felt like an attempt to cover something she couldn't erase, memories she could neither forget nor speak about. Sometimes, as she worked, she would pause by the patient's doors with names and room numbers on small brass plates. Behind each one was a veteran in some stage of recovery. Men and women with missing limbs, scarred faces, and eyes that carried stories of wars that the world had already forgotten. Lena respected their silence. In a strange way, she understood it. That need to hide the war inside, to find peace in the routine of small, ordinary things. When she passed by the common area, a few of the older veterans would nod at her. She'd nod back but rarely stop to talk. One man, a retired Marine, once joked, "You paint like you're covering up a battlefield." Lena had smiled faintly at that, a flicker of something almost human, but said nothing. To most people, she was a mystery that didn't need solving. She did her job well, never caused trouble, and disappeared quietly when her shift was done. She always wore long sleeves, even in the heat, claiming she was used to the uniform. No one questioned it. No one noticed the way her left wrist seemed almost sacred to her, always hidden, always out of sight. When she clocked out at the end of the day, Lena would walk home alone through the quiet streets, her small apartment just a few blocks from the center. The walls there were bare except for a single sketch, a rough pencil drawing of a hawk in flight, wings spread wide, drawn on paper that looked aged and worn. She'd glance at it before bed, her expression unreadable. Every night, she would tell herself she was doing fine, that she had built a quiet, invisible life, safe, distant, simple. And for a while, that illusion held, until the day a Navy SEAL named Ethan Cole walked through the doors of the center and noticed what no one else had ever seen. It was late autumn when Ethan Cole first walked through the sliding glass doors of the St. Helena Veterans Rehabilitation Center, a place built to patch up what war left behind, both in body and in soul. Outside, the leaves had begun to die beautifully, turning the grounds into a collage of amber and rust. Inside, the world smelled faintly of antiseptic, coffee, and quiet resignation. Ethan was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with that unmistakable discipline that never quite leaves a soldier. But his eyes, deep sea gray and restless, betrayed the truth. He was exhausted, not in body, but in spirit. Every movement seemed measured, as though he were calculating how much effort it took simply to exist in a world that had stopped making sense. He had come here not as a patient, but as a volunteer. After 12 years of active duty, 6 deployments, 2 commendations, and more scars than he could count, he had been medically discharged following an explosion during a rescue operation overseas. He had survived barely, but many of his teammates had not. The medic who saved his life had been one of them, Sergeant LM. The name still echoed in his nightmares. She had been calm under fire, the kind of soldier who brought steadiness to chaos. He remembered her shouting orders, patching wounds with bloodied hands, and refusing to leave anyone behind. Until the ambush, until the day everything went wrong. He never saw her again. The official report had said she was captured and later presumed killed. Ethan had spent months blaming himself for being the one she saved, for not going back, for surviving when she hadn't, when his therapist suggested volunteer work at the rehabilitation center. He had resisted at first. The idea of being around more veterans, more broken reflections of himself, was unbearable. But over time, the silence of civilian life had become worse. So he went, not out of hope, but out of desperation to feel useful again. On his first day, the administrator assigned him light work, helping move supplies, assisting in art therapy sessions, and lending a hand wherever needed. "Just keep busy," she said kindly. "That's half the battle," he nodded. He understood battles all too well. That was when he first saw her, Lena Matthews. She was standing at the end of a corridor, painting one of the double doors near the physical therapy wing. The afternoon light filtered through the windows, laying soft gold across the hall, catching on the flecks of white paint in her hair. She didn't notice him. Her movements were slow, methodical. There was something almost peaceful about the way she worked. He paused for a moment, watching her. There was something familiar about the rhythm of her motion, the same quiet discipline he had seen in soldiers on the field. The same focus that came from trying to silence noise inside one's head. He passed her without a word, but the image stayed with him. Over the next few days, Ethan saw her often. She was always there before him, always working in silence. The other workers greeted her with polite nods, but never engaged much. She never joined the lunch table chatter, never shared stories, never complained. Yet, he noticed the details others didn't. The faint stiffness in her posture, like someone who had learned to bear pain without showing it. The small tremor in her left hand when she reached for a higher spot. The way her eyes darted slightly whenever she heard loud noises. Not fear, but recognition. Ethan didn't know why he cared. Maybe it was because she reminded him of someone he used to know, or maybe it was because she carried the same silence he did. The kind that doesn't come from shyness, but from loss. One morning, he found himself walking beside her in the hall, as she carried a new can of paint. "Need a hand?" he asked casually. She looked up startled, then shook her head. "I'm fine," she said softly. Her voice was calm, steady, with that hint of distance people develop when they've forgotten how to expect kindness. He smiled faintly. "You work here full-time?" "Just contract," she replied. "Long hours for contract work." She gave a small shrug. "It keeps me busy, that was all." She turned back to her door, and the conversation ended like a wave retreating from the shore. But something about her voice lingered in his mind, a tone he couldn't quite place. Later, while helping stack supplies, Ethan overheard two orderlies talking. "That painter woman's strange," one said. "Barely talks." "Yeah," the other replied. "But she works harder than anyone else." "I heard she never takes a day off." Ethan smiled to himself. Strange or not, he respected that. Discipline, quiet endurance. The kind of traits he understood. As days turned into weeks, he noticed the small details others missed. How she always wore long sleeves, even when the heating made the hallways uncomfortably warm. How she flinched when anyone accidentally brushed against her left wrist. How she seemed to always find corners to work in alone, as though solitude was her armor. One afternoon, as she reached high to paint the upper frame of a door, the sleeve of her shirt slid down slightly. Ethan's gaze caught on the brief flash of ink on her wrist, just a small curve, part of a design, before she quickly pulled her sleeve back down. He didn't think much of it then. It was only a second. But the next day, when the same thing happened again, when he saw it clearly this time, a black hawk's wing and the faint outline of numbers beneath, his heart stopped. For the first time in months, his hands began to tremble. He knew that tattoo. He had seen it burned into his memory, on the wrist of the medic who had pulled him from the wreckage, bleeding and broken, shouting orders as chaos swallowed the night. The medic they had buried in name only. The medic whose initials had been LM. He looked at her now, quiet, alive, painting doors, as if nothing had ever happened, and felt his entire world tilt. It couldn't be her, but every instinct in his body whispered that it was. Ethan stood frozen in the hallway, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it echo in his ears. The faint scent of paint and cleaning solution mixed with the sharpness of memory, metallic, smoky, and far away. For a brief second, he wasn't in a quiet veterans center anymore. He was back in the desert, dust swirling around him, the air shaking with the sound of gunfire, and the medic with the hawk tattoo pressing gauze against his wound. Her voice steady even as the world fell apart. He blinked hard, forcing himself to breathe. No, it couldn't be. But the tattoo was the same. A black hawk mid-flight with a string of numbers underneath, coordinates. The coordinates of their forward operating base. Only members of their small special operations unit had that tattoo. Only a handful of people in the world, and one of them, Sergeant LM, the combat medic who had saved his life, was supposed to be dead. Ethan watched Lena from a distance that afternoon, every instinct in him torn between disbelief and certainty. Her movements were familiar, the same focus, the same calm precision he had seen that night under fire. But she looked older, thinner, her expression weighed down by something more than time. Her hair, once military short, now fell past her shoulders. Yet the eyes, grey, sharp, alert, they hadn't changed at all. He wanted to speak to her, but words felt impossible. What could he even say? "You're supposed to be dead" didn't seem like a gentle opening line. So he waited. For hours. For a chance. That chance came near the end of the day. Lena was finishing up in one of the long corridors, cleaning her brushes in a plastic tray near the janitor's closet. Ethan approached slowly, his boots echoing softly on the linoleum floor. "Hey," he said, voice careful, almost tentative. She turned, startled, her eyes flicking up to his. "Oh, hi. You need this hallway?" "No," he said. "I just wanted to ask you something." She paused, studying him for a moment. The light was fading outside, streaking the corridor with orange and gold. Her face looked serene, but her fingers tightened subtly around the brush handle. She was cautious, defensive, a soldier's reflex, though she hid it well. Ethan took a breath. "That tattoo on your wrist, what does it mean?" For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The brush slipped slightly in her hand, leaving a small streak of paint across the tray's edge. Then, without looking at him, she rolled down her sleeve calmly and said, "It's just a design. Nothing special." Her voice was steady, but her eyes flickered just for a second with something sharp. Recognition, fear. Ethan stepped closer. "No, it's not just a design. I've seen it before." Her hand froze. He continued, his tone tightening. "A black hawk with coordinates underneath. You don't forget that. Not when you've bled next to it." Lena's breathing changed, subtle, shallow. "You're mistaken," she said softly, her back now slightly turned toward him. But Ethan's voice broke through the silence, rough with disbelief. "You're her, aren't you? Sergeant L.M., the medic from Operation Iron Wind." He could barely say the words. "You died in that ambush. We buried you. There was a service, a name on the memorial wall." She slowly turned then, her gray eyes meeting his. For a long time, neither of them spoke. There was no panic in her gaze, just exhaustion. The kind of weariness that came from running too long, from carrying too many ghosts. Finally, she sighed. "You shouldn't talk about that here." Her voice trembled just slightly, enough for him to feel the truth behind it. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You were listed as KIA. What happened, Lena? Why are you here painting doors under a different name?" "Unmer." She shook her head. "Please," she whispered, her tone almost pleading now. "Just let it go." "I can't," he said. "You saved my life. You think I could ever forget your face? Your voice?" His throat tightened. "You were the bravest person I ever met. I watched that convoy explode. I thought you were gone." Her jaw clenched, and something inside her seemed to break. She set down the brush slowly and leaned against the wall, her eyes glistening but not spilling a single tear. "I was gone, Ethan," she said quietly. "At least that's what I wanted." He frowned, confusion mixing with grief. "Why? Why disappear?" "Everyone thought—" "I know," she interrupted gently, her tone flat, distant. "And I let them. It was easier that way." For a moment, only silence filled the corridor, heavy, electric, and fragile. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "They took me after the ambush. Not for long, but long enough to destroy whatever was left of me. When I escaped, I was different. The army wanted a statement, a press report, a survivor story. I wanted none of it. So I walked away, changed my name, buried who I was." Ethan's throat went dry. The reality hit him like a gut punch. He tried to imagine what she'd endured and failed. All he could see was the shadow of the woman before him, painting doors to forget what the world had done to her. "Lena," he murmured, his voice breaking. She looked at him steadily now, her expression calm again, almost serene. "Please, Ethan, I've made peace with my disappearance. Let it stay that way. Whatever you remember, keep it between us." He wanted to protest, to argue, to tell her the world deserved to know she survived. But something in her eyes, that haunted, steady resilience, stopped him. It wasn't shame he saw there. It was survival. The kind that doesn't need recognition, only quiet. After a long silence, he nodded faintly. "Okay, I won't tell anyone." "Thank you," she whispered. He hesitated, then added softly, "But I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to hide from me." For the first time in years, Lena smiled, faint, sad, but real. It was a smile that spoke of gratitude, sorrow, and something she had long forgotten: trust. As she turned back to her painting, Ethan walked away slowly, his mind a storm of disbelief and awe. He had come to the rehabilitation center looking for redemption. Instead, he had found a ghost who was still alive, and perhaps a reason to start living again himself. For days after their conversation, Ethan couldn't focus on anything else. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that moment in the corridor, Lena's face pale beneath the fading light, her eyes haunted yet defiant, her voice low but steady. She was alive, after all these years, after the guilt, after the nightmares. The woman he thought had died because of him was standing right there, breathing the same air, painting doors in silence. He needed answers. But more than that, he needed to understand why she had chosen to disappear. He didn't want to push her. He knew trauma when he saw it. He'd lived with it long enough to recognize its signs: the flinch at sudden sounds, the sleepless eyes, the carefully measured responses to questions that grazed too close to memory. But the truth had a way of demanding light, and Ethan, despite every instinct to tread lightly, couldn't let it go. He started quietly asking around the facility, nothing invasive, just enough to see what others knew about her. The answers were always the same. She's been here less than a year. Good worker. Keeps to herself. Lives a few blocks away, I think. Never talks about family. No one knew more than that. It was as though Lena had appeared out of thin air. That night, Ethan sat alone in his small apartment, a folder spread open before him. Inside were old mission reports, yellowed photographs, and a casualty list he had memorized years ago. His hand hovered over the name, Sergeant L.M., KIA, Operation Iron Wind, cause of death, captured during enemy ambush, presumed deceased after failed recovery, but now that neat little line of text was a lie. He ran his finger over the typed words, his chest tightening. "Why, Lena?" he whispered to the empty room. "Why vanish when you could have come home?" The next day, he found her outside the center, sitting on a bench beneath a maple tree, eating lunch alone. The sky was pale and cold, the kind of day where even the wind seemed to move quietly. Ethan approached slowly. "Do you mind if I sit?" he asked. She hesitated for a second, then nodded. "Sure." They sat in silence for a while. The leaves rustled softly overhead. Lena sipped from a thermos, her eyes following a group of rehab patients laughing near the entrance, a rare moment of joy she didn't join. Ethan finally spoke. "I looked at the records," he said quietly. "They said you were gone." "I was," she replied. No anger, no surprise. Just a simple statement. He waited, sensing she wasn't done. After a moment, she continued, her voice distant, as if she were reciting someone else's story. "After the ambush, they found us. I was the only one still alive. They took me. I don't remember much of those first days, only noise and pain. I thought it would end quickly. It didn't." Ethan's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists on his knees. She went on, her tone eerily calm. "After 3 weeks, they moved us. I escaped during a sandstorm. Wandered until a local patrol found me. When the medics brought me in, I wasn't Sergeant Matthews anymore. I was just another broken name without a unit. I begged them not to send me home, not to tell anyone. I didn't want the headlines or the sympathy. I didn't want to see the looks in their eyes." Her voice cracked slightly, the first break in her composure. "I wasn't the same. I didn't deserve to come back." Ethan stared at her, feeling the ache of her words settle deep in his chest. "You deserve to live," he said firmly. She shook her head. "Living isn't the same as being alive, Ethan. You don't come back from something like that whole. You just paint over the cracks and hope nobody looks too close." He wanted to reach out to comfort her, but he knew better. Soldiers like her, like him, didn't want pity. They wanted understanding. So he said quietly, "You didn't paint over the cracks, Lena. You survived them." That evening, Ethan stayed late in the hallway where she worked. He didn't speak, didn't intrude, just worked beside her, handing her brushes and helping carry paint cans. It wasn't conversation, but it was company. And for Lena, that was something. Over the following days, a strange rhythm formed between them. He'd find excuses to be near her, fixing a light, moving supplies, helping her tape off door frames. She never protested. Slowly, she began to open up in fragments, small, fragile confessions buried beneath the weight of silence. "I used to paint walls in the outpost," she said one evening, her voice soft. "When the generators failed and the lights went out, I'd paint little markings in the dark so the guys could find their way back to the medic tent. Funny how habits stick," he smiled faintly. "Still saving people even now?" She shook her head. "No, just keeping things in order. It helps me forget." But Ethan noticed something change. As they worked side by side, her walls began to thin. Her voice softened. Sometimes he'd catch her humming quietly under her breath, a tune he almost recognized from their old camp days. And one afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the newly painted doors, she finally looked at him and said, "You should have left me there." "Ethan, You shouldn't have carried my ghost all these years. He met her gaze steadily. I didn't carry your ghost, Lena. I carried your courage. Her eyes glistened, and this time she didn't look away. Still, Ethan couldn't shake his need to protect her. Something about the way she flinched at certain sounds, the way she froze when unfamiliar men approached. It made him suspect that whatever had happened overseas had followed her home in more ways than one. He searched military archives discreetly, pulling favor from old contacts. What he found chilled him. Reports of an unidentified survivor rescued from captivity months after Lena's supposed death, listed under a different name. The description matched her exactly. There were also sealed records, files classified beyond his clearance level. But the summary notes told enough of a story. Psychological trauma, identity reassignment, medical discharge, civilian relocation. She hadn't just disappeared. Someone had helped her disappear. Ethan sat in his car that night, the file trembling in his hands. She had been given a chance to start over, to erase the soldier she once was. And now, by recognizing her, he had risked tearing that fragile piece apart. He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel, torn between truth and compassion. He had found her, but maybe finding her wasn't the same as saving her. That same night, in her small, dimly lit apartment, Lena sat by the window, watching the streetlights shimmer on the pavement below. The world was quiet, too quiet. On her bedside table lay a faded dog tag, its surface scratched and worn. Cole Ethan. She ran her thumb across the letters, eyes distant. She had kept it all these years, the tag she'd taken from his neck the night she saved him. The one she swore she'd return if they ever met again. She had never imagined it would happen this way. A tear slipped down her cheek, the first in years, not of sorrow, but of something gentler. Relief, because after everything, after the pain, the hiding, the silence, someone still remembered her, and more importantly, someone still saw her. The air inside the rehabilitation center was heavy that evening, still, almost reverent, as though the building itself sensed something was about to break. Outside, the last light of day bled into the horizon, painting the windows with shades of gold and melancholy. Lena was alone in the west corridor, finishing the last of her paintwork. The hall was quiet, save for the soft brushstrokes and the faint hum of the ventilation system. The smell of fresh paint mingled with the sterile scent of the hospital floor, a familiar mixture that had somehow become her refuge. She worked slower than usual, her mind elsewhere. For days, she'd felt Ethan's presence, the way he watched her from a respectful distance, the way his silence filled the air heavier than words ever could. He hadn't confronted her again, but she could feel the weight of the truth pressing between them. She didn't know how much he had uncovered, or how much he still remembered. But part of her, a small, fragile part, hoped he would come to her again, because for the first time in years, she wasn't sure she could carry the silence alone. She was washing her brushes when she heard his footsteps echo down the corridor. Steady, unhurried, familiar. She didn't need to look up to know it was him. Long day. Ethan's voice broke the quiet gently. She nodded without turning. They always are. He took a few steps closer, his tone careful. You don't have to keep pretending, Lena. Her hand froze mid-motion. The sound of dripping water filled the pause. Pretending. She repeated, her voice low, almost cautious. That you're okay, he said. That painting doors is enough to bury what happened. Lena sighed, setting the brush down. You don't understand, she murmured. I do, Ethan replied softly. I've been where you are. Finally, she turned to face him. The fading light caught her face, revealing the exhaustion etched into every line. No, Ethan, she said quietly. You've been through hell, but I became it. Her voice trembled for the first time. She took a step back, leaning against the wall, arms folded tightly as if holding herself together. They told me to talk about it, she continued, bitterness threading through her tone. To see a therapist, to share. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't feel what I felt. You know what happens when you tell people you were captured, when you say you survived what others didn't. They don't see you as a hero. They see you as damaged goods. Her voice cracked, her control slipping. I was tired of being someone's broken story, Ethan, tired of seeing pity in their eyes. So I disappeared. I painted over my past, and I built a life where nobody knew what I'd lost. Ethan's chest tightened. Every word was a blade, not aimed at him, but at the world that had failed her. He took a cautious step forward. Lena, he said softly, you didn't run away. You survived. There's a difference. She shook her head, her eyes glistening. I abandoned them. You, the unit, everyone. You think I don't remember that day. You think I don't hear the screaming every time I close my eyes. Her voice broke entirely now, tears streaking down her face. I should have stayed behind with the others. I shouldn't have made it out when they didn't. Ethan's throat ached. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that she had no reason to carry this guilt, but she wasn't ready for reassurance. She needed to release it, to face the ghosts. He stepped closer, his voice low but firm. You didn't abandon us, Lena. You saved us. You saved me. You dragged me out of that fire when I couldn't move. You carried me across the sand, bleeding and half dead. You think that was weakness? She shook her head violently, trembling. You don't know what they did to me afterward. You don't know what I had to do to survive. Ethan's eyes darkened, his voice rough. You don't have to tell me. But you don't get to blame yourself for living. Lena's breath came uneven now, her defenses finally collapsing. She pressed her palm to her forehead, her body shaking. I thought if I stayed gone, the memories would stop chasing me. But they didn't. Every day I wake up and I paint something new, just so I don't have to remember what's been lost. Her voice fell to a whisper. But when you saw me, when you said my name again, it all came back. Ethan took one more step toward her, close enough now that she could feel his presence, not threatening, just steady, grounding. Maybe it came back because you're not supposed to hide forever, he said gently. You're supposed to heal. She met his eyes then, truly looked at him. And what she saw there broke her, because he wasn't looking at her with pity. He wasn't looking at her like she was a ghost. He was looking at her like she was real. Slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small and metallic. Ethan's breath caught as she held it out to him. His dog tag, battered, scratched, the same one he had lost that night. I kept it, she said softly. When I pulled you out, I told myself if I made it, I'd return it. I just didn't think I'd live long enough to keep that promise. Ethan's hand trembled as he took it. The metal was cold, heavy with memory. You kept me alive that night, he whispered. Now it's my turn to keep you alive. That was all it took. The last of Lena's walls crumbled. She covered her face with her hands and began to sob, not quiet tears, but years of pain pouring out in ragged waves. Ethan stepped forward, pulling her into his arms, holding her like someone anchoring another back to the world. She resisted at first, then gave in, collapsing against him. For the first time since the war, she allowed herself to be held, not as a soldier, not as a survivor, but as a human being. The hallway was silent, except for the soft hum of the air vents and her quiet sobs. Ethan didn't speak. He simply held her, letting her grief unravel. After a while, when her breathing steadied, she stepped back slightly, wiping her face. Sorry, she murmured. He smiled gently. Don't be. You've carried too much for too long. She looked at him, her expression tired but lighter somehow, as if a part of her had finally been set free. What now? She asked quietly. Ethan looked down at the dog tag in his hand, then back at her. Now, he said, we stop pretending we're the only ones who survived. For a long moment they just stood there, the golden light washing over them. Lena exhaled slowly, almost smiling. You're not going to let me hide again, are you? Not a chance, Ethan said softly. And for the first time in years, Lena Matthews, the woman who had painted over her pain, felt something stir inside her chest. Not fear, not guilt, but hope. The next morning, sunlight filtered softly through the tall windows of the rehabilitation center. Dust motes drifted lazily in the golden beams, dancing above the hallway Lena had painted just days before. The once faded blue doors now gleamed with quiet dignity, like sentinels standing guard over the wounded souls inside. Lena stood there, her paintbrush hanging loosely at her side. But this morning was different. Her sleeves were rolled up, her tattoo visible in the light, a small hawk in flight with coordinates etched beneath its wings. She didn't hide it anymore. For the first time in years, she didn't need to. Ethan found her in the courtyard later that morning. He moved slowly, leaning a little on his cane, still recovering from the lingering injury that had brought him here. He stopped a few feet away, watching her in silence as she sat on the bench, sketching something in her worn notebook. "What are you working on?" he asked gently. She glanced up, the faintest hint of a smile crossing her lips. "A mural," she said, "for the west wall of the center. I thought it might be time to paint something." "Bigger?" Ethan's eyebrows rose slightly. "Bigger?" She nodded. "Something that says we're still here, that we made it back." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind rustled the trees, carrying with it the faint laughter of patience from inside. Finally, Ethan said quietly, "You should let me help." Lena looked at him, seeing the same determination that once led men into battle, not to destroy this time, but to rebuild. She nodded. "Then let's start today." Over the next few weeks, the two of them worked side by side on the mural. At first, they painted in silence, comfortable, shared silence. Ethan prepped the wall, smoothing its rough patches. Lena mapped out the design, a soaring hawk breaking through storm clouds, surrounded by silhouettes of men and women rising from shadows into light. Patients and staff would stop by to watch. Some would bring coffee. Others would just sit quietly, finding comfort in the sight of color blooming where once there had been only gray. Each day, more veterans began to join in. The man missing his leg painted the outlines of clouds. A young nurse filled them with shades of dawn. A Marine with trembling hands painted a sun, crooked but bright. By the time the mural neared completion, it wasn't just Lena's project anymore. It belonged to everyone, a collective act of healing, painted stroke by stroke. One evening, as they stood back to look at the finished work, Ethan turned to her. "You know, this wall, it's more than paint." Lena smiled faintly. "It's a promise," she said, "that even when the world breaks you, you can still build something beautiful with what's left." A few days later, Lena received a letter. It was from the Department of Veterans Affairs, a follow-up on the records Ethan had quietly requested to be reviewed. Inside was a single official sentence: status of Sergeant Lena Matthews, corrected from deceased to active civilian, retired service. Her hands trembled as she read it. She sat in her room for a long time, the letter resting on her lap. For years, she had been a ghost, unseen, unacknowledged, uncounted. Now finally, she was real again. That evening, she found Ethan near the mural, cleaning up paint trays. Without a word, she handed him the letter. He read it slowly, then smiled. The kind of quiet, steady smile that said everything without a sound. "So," he said softly, "no more ghosts." She exhaled, tears glistening in her eyes. "No more ghosts." They stood there for a moment looking at the mural, the hawk soaring above the storm, wings spread wide. Ethan glanced at her wrist, then back to her eyes. "You should never cover that again," he said. She looked down at the tattoo, the mark she had once thought of as a scar. Now it felt like something else entirely. "I won't," she said simply. Months passed. The mural became a local symbol of hope, drawing visitors from across the city. Veterans who had stopped seeking help began returning, inspired by what they saw, not just the art, but the story behind it. Lena and Ethan began leading small workshops together, art therapy sessions, storytelling circles, volunteer painting projects at other centers. He taught discipline and endurance. She taught expression and release. Together they built something that neither could have done alone. One day, after finishing a session with a group of young soldiers, Ethan found Lena standing near the mural again, her gaze distant but peaceful. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" he asked. She smiled softly. "Every day," she said. But for once I'm not afraid of it, he nodded, understanding completely. You know, he added after a pause, when I saw you that first day painting those doors, I thought you were hiding from the world. I was, she admitted. But maybe I just needed the right reason to stop. Ethan's voice softened. And you found it? She looked up at the wall, at the hawk soaring free. No, she said, her voice steady. We found it. The sun began to set, casting the mural in a golden glow. The painted hawk seemed alive in the light, its wings almost moving with the wind. Lena lifted her paintbrush once more and added a final touch. A small, almost invisible detail at the bottom corner, 2 initials, entwined beneath the image of the rising sun, Lena and Ethan. She stepped back, her chest rising with a deep, quiet breath. Ethan came to stand beside her, hands in his pockets. Looks like we finished, he said softly. Lena smiled. No, she murmured. We just began. They stood together in the glow of the mural, 2 souls once broken by war, now piecing the world back together, one brushstroke at a time. For years, she painted to forget. Now she painted to remember, not the pain, but the strength that came after. The seasons changed. Winter's chill gave way to spring, and with it came the quiet rhythm of renewal, the slow, steady return of color to a world that once felt gray. The Veterans Rehabilitation Center had become more than a building. It had become a sanctuary, a place where broken souls learned that healing was not about forgetting the past, but about reclaiming it. And at the heart of it all, 2 people stood who had once been lost to their own silence, Lena Matthews and Ethan Cole. Months after the mural's completion, journalists came to photograph it. Students visited on field trips. Veterans brought their families, pointing to the soaring hawk as though it represented a piece of themselves. There was a plaque beneath the mural now, simple but powerful, for those who carried the weight and still chose to stand, dedicated by Lena Matthews and Ethan Cole. When asked about the meaning behind the artwork, Lena would only smile and say, "It's not about what we painted. It's about what we survived to paint it." She had learned to speak to crowds again, quietly, but with a voice that carried the calm strength of someone who had lived through darkness and found light on the other side. Ethan's limp had lessened, his face no longer drawn by pain. He spent his days teaching resilience workshops to young recruits, not to glorify war, but to prepare them for the unseen battles after it. Sometimes, he would look at the hawk on the wall and remember the day he froze in that hallway, when a single glimpse of a tattoo had pulled him back into a past he thought he'd buried. Now he understood it wasn't the past calling him back. It was life, asking him to finish what had been left undone. Lena continued to paint, not doors anymore, but stories. She traveled to other centers, leading art therapy programs for veterans, trauma survivors, and children of soldiers who never came home. Her sleeves remained rolled up wherever she went. The tattoo that once marked her pain now stood as her signature, her quiet declaration of endurance. And every time someone asked about it, she would say, "This isn't a mark of who I was. It's a reminder of who I chose to become." One spring afternoon, on the anniversary of the mural's completion, Lena returned to the center. Ethan was already there, standing before the wall with a group of new patients. When he saw her, he smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that spoke of shared understanding. "Did you ever think," he asked softly, "that a few cans of paint and an old wall could change lives?" Lena looked at the mural, the hawk, the clouds, the light. "No," she said quietly, "but I always believed broken things could still be made beautiful." They stood in silence, watching a young man in a wheelchair add a small stroke of color near the base of the mural. For a moment, the world felt whole again. She had spent years painting doors, hiding behind color to cover her scars. Until one day, someone saw her not as what she had lost, but as what she had survived. He had walked through battlefields, carrying guilt heavier than armor, until he learned that some wars aren't fought with guns, but with forgiveness, Together they discovered that healing doesn't happen in silence. It happens in the small, brave acts of being seen again. And so, the woman who once painted doors to forget began painting the world to remember. As the camera pans across the mural, sunlight bursts through the clouds, illuminating the hawk's wings. Lena and Ethan stand beneath it side by side, their shadows merging with the painted flight above them. For the first time in years, she no longer hid the mark on her wrist, because someone finally saw not what it meant, but what she had survived.